There is a version of the First World War that most people carry in their heads without knowing it. It lives in the image of young men in neat uniforms, standing at attention before a crowd of cheering strangers. It lives in recruitment posters that promised adventure, in the bronze statues that line town squares in England, France, Belgium, Germany, and 100 other places, in the silence observed every November when bugles play into cold morning air. That version of the war is a story built on top of another story. The real one was never meant to be told in full. The real one was not a story of courage rewarded or sacrifice honored. It was something closer to a system, a cold, indifferent, bureaucratically managed system that consumed human beings by the millions and learned, with each passing month, how to do it more efficiently. What happened between 1914 and 1918 was not a war in any sense that previous generations would have recognized. It was an industrial event. It was the application of factory logic to the problem of killing, and the men who went through it did not come back the same, if they came back at all. Those who survived often found that the language they had before the war was no longer adequate. They had seen things that did not fit inside the words that existed. They had lived inside realities that civilians could not imagine, and that the governments and military institutions actively worked to prevent civilians from knowing. The censorship was not incidental. It was policy. Letters from the front were read before they were sent. Journalists were kept away from the most damaging scenes. Official reports described advances that were, in reality, disasters. The machine worked to produce a version of itself that could be sustained at home, because the home front had to keep sending men, and it would not keep sending men if it knew what those men were being sent into. What follows is not the version that was managed for public consumption. It is the version that existed in the trenches, in the field hospitals, in the medical reports that were classified, in the letters that were censored, in the psychiatric wards that were given other names because the real name was too damaging to say out loud. It is the version that became ordinary, not extraordinary, ordinary. That is the part that is hardest to understand from a distance of more than 100 years. The things that should have been unthinkable became routine. The things that should have broken the system were simply absorbed by it and filed away. The war began with an idea about what war was. That idea did not survive the first winter. By the end of 1914, the Western Front had settled into a configuration that nobody had planned for, and nobody knew how to escape. The great advances that military strategists had projected, the sweeping movements of cavalry, the decisive battles that would end the conflict in months, had failed to materialize. Instead, two enormous armies had dug into the earth and faced each other across a strip of land that was both no man's land and the only land that mattered. The trenches that emerged from that first winter were not temporary. They became permanent. They became home. And home, in this case, was a place designed around the daily expectation of death. The trench system that evolved along the Western Front stretched for roughly 440 miles, from the coast of Belgium in the north to the Swiss border in the south. It was not a single line, but a network, a series of parallel trenches connected by communication trenches, dotted with dugouts and observation posts and listening posts, pushed out into no man's land itself. The men who lived in this system did not experience it as a battlefield in any dramatic sense. They experienced it as a place where time moved strangely, where danger was constant but often invisible, and where the body was subjected to conditions that no human body was designed to tolerate for the length of time that the war required. The first thing that the trench did was wet. It was almost always wet. The geography of Flanders and much of the Somme region meant that when men dug down far enough, they hit water. The trenches drained poorly or did not drain at all. Men stood in water for hours, for days. The water was not clean. It mixed with mud, with the contents of latrines that overflowed, with the runoff from ground that had been churned by artillery and soaked in the residue of everything that war left behind. Standing in that water, wearing boots that were not designed for continuous immersion, men's feet began to change. The condition that developed was called trench foot, and in the early years of the war, it was so widespread that it threatened the operational capacity of entire divisions. Trench foot was not frostbite, though it was sometimes confused with it. It was the result of prolonged exposure to cold, wet conditions that were not quite cold enough to freeze. The feet would swell, turn numb, then red, then blue, then black as tissue began to die. In severe cases, gangrene set in. In the most severe cases, amputation was the only remaining option. In the first winter alone, tens of thousands of British soldiers were treated for the condition. The French and German armies experienced comparable numbers. The medical corps recognized quickly that this was not a wound in any traditional sense. It was a product of the environment itself. The environment was the weapon. The military response to trench foot was characteristic of how the institution processed problems that were inconvenient. It issued regulations. Officers were made responsible for ensuring that their men changed their socks regularly, that they dried their feet, that they applied whale oil as a waterproofing agent. The regulations were real. The conditions that made following them nearly impossible were also real. Men who were under artillery bombardment did not stop to dry their feet. Men who were ordered to hold a position in 3 feet of standing water could not step out of that water to comply with medical instructions. The regulations became a form of blame transfer. If a man developed trench foot, the implication was that he had not followed the proper procedures. The environment that made following those procedures impossible was not addressed in any fundamental way, because addressing it would have meant addressing the trench system itself, and the trench system was the war. The rats were there from the beginning. They arrived with the first men who dug in, and they never left. The Western Front rat population grew to numbers that defy easy comprehension. Millions of animals feeding on the waste of armies and on the bodies of the dead, growing fat in ways that witnesses described with a kind of stunned disbelief. The rats were bold. They did not behave the way rats in ordinary environments behave. They had learned that humans in the trenches were not a threat to them, or not reliably so. They moved through dugouts while men were sleeping. They ate food from unattended plates and from packs left on the ground. Men woke to find rats sitting on their chests. Men went to sleep wearing gloves because they had learned that rats, searching for any organic material, would gnaw at the calloused skin of their hands. This was not a temporary problem that resolved itself. It was a permanent feature of the environment, something that men incorporated into their daily experience of the war, the same way they incorporated the mud, and the noise, and the smell. Soldiers developed informal relationships with the rats that surrounded them. Some killed them compulsively. Some named them. Some became indifferent in a way that said more about what prolonged exposure to an extreme environment does to ordinary human responses than any deliberate psychological analysis could. The rats were present at Verdun and at the Somme and at Passchendaele. They outlasted individual soldiers and individual units. They were, in some sense, the most successful organisms on the Western Front. The lice were everywhere. They were so universal that they ceased to function as a subject of complaint and became simply a fact of physical existence. Every man in the trenches had them, officers and enlisted men alike. The lice lived in the seams of clothing, in the folds of blankets, in the hair. They fed on blood. They produced an itching that was constant and that never fully resolved itself, even when men were pulled back from the front for rest periods. Bathing was irregular, and when it occurred, it was rarely thorough enough to eliminate an infestation entirely. Men would spend their rest periods in what they called delousing, running a candle flame along the seams of their uniforms to kill the insects and their eggs, a process that provided temporary relief, but not elimination. The lice were not merely an irritant. They were a vector. Trench fever, a bacterial infection transmitted by louse feces entering small breaks in the skin, was widespread enough to be a significant medical problem throughout the war. The symptoms included high fever, severe headaches, and pain in the legs and back severe enough to be incapacitating. Men could be sick with it for weeks. Some recovered, some relapsed. The causative organism was not identified until 1918. by which point millions of men had passed through the condition without any effective treatment existing for it. The medical system dealt with trench fever largely by documenting it and sending men back when they recovered, because there was nothing else to be done. The smell of the front was something that survivors mentioned repeatedly across memoirs and letters and post-war interviews in terms that suggested it was among the most lasting sensory impressions of the experience. It was not a single smell, but a compound of many smells, some identifiable and some not. There was the smell of mud, which was not simply earth, but earth mixed with decomposing organic matter. A rich and heavy smell that clung to clothing and skin. There was the smell of cordite and explosive residue after artillery fire. There was the smell of the latrines, which were simple pits dug into the earth and which, in the density of the trench system, were never far away. There was the smell of unwashed bodies, of wet wool, of the disinfectants that were applied liberally to prevent infection. And underneath all of it, whenever the wind shifted in a particular direction, or when the heat of summer rose from ground that had been fought over, there was the smell of the dead. The dead were a practical problem in the trenches in a way that is difficult to articulate without sounding clinical. They could not always be buried. When a man was killed in no man's land, retrieving his body to give it proper burial might require risking additional lives. And there were times when the military calculation was that the risk was not justified. Bodies lay in no man's land for days, for weeks, sometimes for the length of an entire campaign. When new trenches were dug, they sometimes cut through ground that had been fought over before, and the spades of the digging parties would turn up remains that had been in the earth for months. The practice of building trench walls meant that bodies became incorporated into the structure of the front itself. Men who worked on the construction of dugouts and communication trenches sometimes found that the revetments they were reinforcing had been shored up with the bodies of men who had been killed before they arrived. This was not a secret. It was simply another feature of the environment that had to be incorporated into daily functioning. Men learned to not look at certain things too closely. They learned to breathe through their mouths in certain sections of the line. They learned that the body's reactions to horror diminish with prolonged exposure, that what produces nausea and shock on first encounter becomes, eventually, something that the nervous system processes without dramatic response. This adaptation was not a failure of moral feeling. It was a survival mechanism. It was also, when examined from outside, one of the most disturbing aspects of what the war did to the people it absorbed. The artillery was the defining sound of the Western Front. It was present in all but the very shortest pauses in the fighting, and even in those pauses it was never fully silent in the way that silence is ordinarily understood. Men who had been at the front for any length of time learned to read the sound of incoming shells, to distinguish by pitch and trajectory what kind of shell was coming and where it was likely to land, whether it warranted throwing themselves into the mud or whether it would pass overhead. This skill, developed through a combination of observation and desperate necessity, was not infallible. Men who had been at the front for years were killed by shells they had correctly identified as landing elsewhere. The artillery did not respect competence or experience. The bombardments that preceded major offensives reached intensities that have no precise civilian equivalent. The Battle of the Somme in 1916 was preceded by 7 days of continuous artillery fire along a 20-mile front. The British fired more than 1.5 million shells in that week. The noise was audible in southern England. The ground over which the shells fell was reduced to a landscape that survivors consistently described as lunar, a word they reached for because no other reference in their experience provided an adequate comparison. Every visible feature of the original landscape had been obliterated. Trees were reduced to splinters. Villages were reduced to rubble that was then reduced to dust. The ground itself was broken into a series of overlapping craters, some of them large enough to hold several men, filled with water and mud and the residue of everything the bombardment had destroyed. The logic behind a bombardment of that scale was straightforward. If enough shells fell on the enemy positions, those positions would be destroyed and the men in them would be killed or so shaken that they would be unable to resist the infantry assault that followed. The logic was sound. The application of it, at the Somme, produced one of the worst single days in the history of the British Army. On the morning of July the 1st, 1916, when the bombardment lifted and the whistles blew, and the men climbed out of their trenches and began walking across no man's land toward the German lines, they discovered that the theory had not matched the reality. The German dugouts, cut much deeper into the chalk than the British planners had anticipated, had protected enough men to man the machine guns. The British soldiers who walked across that ground, in many places still upright and in formation, because they had been told that the resistance would be minimal, were cut down at a rate that the medical services could not absorb. On that single day, the British Army suffered approximately 60,000 casualties, of whom nearly 20,000 were killed. The numbers were so large that they did not fit inside the administrative systems that existed to process them. The records of that day, and the days that followed, reveal something about how military bureaucracy responds to catastrophe at scale. The forms were filled out, the casualty reports were compiled, the telegrams were sent to families. The system processed what it could and deferred what it could not, and it continued to function, because the alternative to the system functioning was the system not functioning, and the system not functioning was something that nobody who was running the war was prepared to contemplate. The offensive at the Somme continued for 4.5 months after that first day. The total casualties for all forces engaged exceeded 1 million. The territorial gains at the end of those 4.5 months amounted to a strip of ground, roughly 6 miles deep at its deepest point. The accounting for the dead was never fully resolved during the war. The system for tracking individual soldiers, for recording where they had fallen and recovering their remains for proper burial, was overwhelmed repeatedly and comprehensively. A significant proportion of the men who died on the Western Front were never individually identified. Their bodies were either not recovered, or recovered without any means of identification, or buried in mass graves whose locations were imperfectly recorded and in some cases lost entirely. The Imperial War Graves Commission, established during the war and continuing its work long after it ended, eventually determined that of the approximately 750,000 British and Commonwealth soldiers killed on the Western Front, roughly a third had no known grave. Their names are recorded on memorials. The Thiepval Memorial on the Somme carries the names of more than 72,000 men who were killed in the Somme sector and have no identified resting place. The Menning Gate at Ypres carries nearly 55,000 names. These memorials are, among other things, monuments to the scale at which individual human identity was lost. The families of men who were killed and whose bodies were never recovered existed in a particular kind of uncertainty that the war's administrative machinery was not equipped to address. They received telegrams informing them that a son or husband or brother was missing in action. Missing did not mean dead, officially, and the distinction mattered enormously to families who could not afford to give up hope. Some of them wrote letters for years after the war ended, to military authorities, to commanding officers, to anyone who might know something, asking what had happened to the man they had lost. Some of those letters received answers. Most did not, because there were no answers to give. The shell shock problem emerged early and was denied for longer than it should have been. The term shell shock itself was a product of the attempt to explain something that the medical establishment was not yet prepared to name correctly. In the early months of the war, soldiers began appearing at aid stations presenting symptoms that did not correspond to any visible physical injury. They were shaking uncontrollably. They had lost the ability to speak, or could only speak in a whisper. They had lost their sight, or their hearing, without any apparent damage to the relevant organs. They had complete memory loss for events that their comrades confirmed had occurred. Some could not stop weeping. Some could not stop moving, pacing or rocking or making repetitive gestures that they could not control. Some had violent nightmares so intense that they had to be restrained from injuring themselves or others while asleep. The initial medical response was shaped by the need to believe that these symptoms had a physical cause, because a physical cause was manageable in a way that a psychological one was not. If the symptoms resulted from the concussive effect of exploding shells on the nervous system, they could be classified, treated as physical wounds, and the men who presented them could be understood as having suffered something external to themselves. This explanation was convenient because it avoided the implication that men were breaking down psychologically under conditions that were, in fact, psychologically unbearable. That implication was dangerous to an institution that needed men to continue enduring those conditions. As the war continued and the numbers of men presenting these symptoms grew into the hundreds of thousands, the physical explanation became harder to sustain. Men who had been nowhere near an explosion displayed the same symptoms as men who had been at the center of one. The condition was clearly related to prolonged exposure to the totality of the front experience, to the continuous noise, the constant danger, the helplessness, the death that was always nearby and always random, the radical incompatibility between the environment and anything that a human nervous system was built to sustain. What was happening was a kind of breakdown that did not fit any category that the military medical establishment had been built to handle. The institutional response to this recognition was not compassionate. In the British Army, men who displayed symptoms of shell shock were divided informally into two categories. Those whose symptoms were determined to have a physical basis were classified as sick, and they received treatment and were not held responsible for their condition. Those whose symptoms were determined to be purely psychological were sometimes classified as cowards, as men who were shirking their duty, as examples of a failure of moral character rather than a failure of the body under impossible stress. The distinction between these two categories was, in practice, often arbitrary, determined by the disposition of the examining officer rather than by any scientific standard, because no scientific standard yet existed. The treatment available for shell shock varied enormously depending on where in the system a man was treated and by whom. Some men were sent to hospitals well behind the lines where they could rest and receive what passed for psychological care. Some were subjected to treatments that would later be recognized as harmful, including the application of electric shocks to paralyzed limbs in the belief that the physical symptom could be driven away by making it painful enough. This method was used by practitioners who were not motivated primarily by cruelty, but by a theoretical framework that located the problem in the body rather than the mind, and by the practical reality that the supply of damaged men was greater than the supply of effective treatments for them. Some men who were classified as lacking moral fiber rather than as genuinely ill were sent back to their units. Some of those men were then killed. Some survived. Some broke down again. Some managed, through a mechanism that nobody fully understood then or fully understands now, to function in the environment that had already broken them once. The military's interest was in getting men back to the line, and the classification of their condition was, in practice, secondary to that interest. There were men who were shot for cowardice or desertion who were, by any standard that would be accepted today, suffering from what is now called post-traumatic stress disorder. The British Army executed 306 of its own soldiers during the war. Of these, a significant proportion were convicted of offences that are now understood to be directly related to psychological breakdown under combat stress. Desertion, quitting a post, disobedience of a lawful order, these were the charges. The underlying reality, in many cases, was that the men charged were not capable of rational volition in the ordinary sense, that they were operating in a state of psychological disintegration that the military system of the time had neither the knowledge nor the inclination to recognize. The executions were carried out by firing squads composed of men from the condemned soldier's own unit, who were given the order and who obeyed it, because the machinery of military discipline required it. The question of what to do with men who were psychologically damaged but not obviously disabled, men who could function at a minimal level but who were changed in ways that would become apparent only later, was never resolved during the war. These men were returned to duty or discharged and sent home. and what happened to them afterward was largely outside the scope of any institution's concern. The war was not interested in the long term. It was interested in what could be done today, with the men available today to maintain the line. The medical system on the Western Front was, by any reasonable measure, the most sophisticated that had ever existed to that point in history. The scale of the casualties required it to be. The chain of evacuation from the front line to the base hospital represented a logistical achievement that involved hundreds of thousands of personnel and an infrastructure of roads, railways, canal boats, and field ambulances that had to function continuously under conditions that periodically made continuous functioning impossible. The system saved lives that would not have been saved in any previous war. It also operated under conditions of demand that regularly exceeded its capacity and that required it to make decisions that would not have been made under different circumstances. Triage, the practice of dividing casualties into those who would recover without treatment, those who might recover with treatment, and those who would not recover regardless, was applied at every level of the evacuation chain. The practical meaning of triage, when the casualty numbers were high enough, was that men who might have survived with immediate and intensive care died because that care was not available and other men were judged to have a better chance. This was not a failure of the medical system. It was the medical system operating as designed under conditions that exceeded the parameters of its design. The men who made triage decisions were not callous. They were doing the only thing that could be done. The knowledge that you were making the only decision that could be made under the circumstances does not make the decision easier to live with. As the post-war writings of many medical officers make clear, the surgery performed in the field hospitals and casualty clearing stations was conducted under conditions that would not be permitted in any modern medical facility. Operating theaters were tents or hastily commandeered farm buildings. Sterilization was imperfect. Lighting was inadequate. The surgeons who worked them operated for hours without breaks, on men who had been waiting for care long enough that their wounds had begun to change, to fill with the bacteria that turned tissue damage into infection, to develop the gas gangrene that could kill a man faster than the original wound. Gas gangrene, caused by Clostridium bacteria that thrived in the disturbed soil of the front, was a particular horror of the Western Front, a condition in which bacterial infection generated gas within the body's tissues, spreading through muscle at a rate that required surgeons to amputate at levels further and further up the limb in order to stay ahead of it, sometimes unsuccessfully. The amputee population generated by the First World War was enormous. Exact numbers are difficult to establish precisely because the record-keeping practices of different national armies were inconsistent, but the scale can be indicated by the fact that the British alone produced approximately 40,000 amputees during the war, and that the total across all participating nations runs to several 100,000. These men were sent home eventually to countries that had not prepared for them in any meaningful way. The pension systems, the rehabilitation facilities, the prosthetics technology of the era, all of these were insufficient for the numbers and the severity of what the men arriving home presented. Workshops that produced artificial limbs ran continuously and still could not meet the demand. Men waited years for prosthetics that were, when they finally arrived, crude by any standard, functional in limited ways, uncomfortable, often painful. The facial wounds of the war require specific attention because they occupied a particular place in the experience of both those who suffered them and those who encountered them afterward. The face is the primary surface of human recognition and identity. Damage to it is damage to the social self in ways that damage to other parts of the body is not. The artillery war, the constant shelling, produced enormous numbers of facial wounds to eyes, noses, jaws, cheeks, foreheads, in combinations and severities that surgeons of the era were not trained to handle. The field of reconstructive surgery, which is now sophisticated enough to accomplish results that would have seemed miraculous to anyone in 1914, was in its absolute infancy at the beginning of the war and was developed largely by necessity and experiment in the years that followed. Harold Gillies, a New Zealand-born surgeon working for the British Army, is credited with much of the foundational work in facial reconstruction. He and his colleagues operated on thousands of men, developing techniques as they went, using skin grafted from other parts of the patient's body to cover damage that had no other remedy. The results were, by modern standards, imperfect. By the standards of what had existed before, they were remarkable. But the men who left Gillies ward and returned to civilian life returned to a world that had not been prepared to see them, that flinched, that looked away, that treated the visible evidence of what the war had done as something that should not be visible. Some hospitals that treated these men installed special blue-painted benches in nearby parks to warn civilians that a man sitting on a blue bench might appear unusual, that they should prepare themselves. The ordinary populations of the belligerent nations knew less about what was happening at the front than they believed they did. The censorship operated through multiple layers, from the military censors who read the mail to the government press offices that worked with newspaper editors to manage what was published to the War Office's control of official photographers and official artists who were the only ones with legal access to the front. The photographs that appeared in newspapers and on recruiting posters showed men in recognizable conditions, tired perhaps, but intact, not showing the things that the front actually looked like when the camera was pointed at the ground rather than at the soldiers standing above it. The gap between the public image of the war and the private reality of it was not only maintained by government policy, it was maintained by the soldiers themselves in part. Men who came home on leave found that they could not talk about what they had experienced in ways that their families could receive. The reactions they got when they tried, the incomprehension, the reflexive patriotism that framed everything as worthwhile and necessary. The civilian world's inability to process information that contradicted the version they had been living with. These reactions taught men to stop trying. The silence that settled between veterans and civilians during the war was one of the most thoroughly documented phenomena of the period, mentioned in memoir after memoir, letter after letter. Men who had been in the trenches found that they had more in common with men they had never met before, men from different regiments and different class backgrounds, than they did with the people they had grown up with, because the shared experience of the front created a category of understanding that nothing else could produce. The gas attacks introduced a weapon that was, in its effects and in the experience of being subjected to it, categorically different from anything that had come before. Chlorine was first used by the Germans at Ypres in April of 1915, released from pressurized cylinders along a 4-mile front on a day when the wind was favorable. The soldiers who saw the yellow-green cloud rolling toward them had no context for what it was. Some retreated, some did not. The chlorine, which is heavier than air, settled into the low points of the terrain, into the trenches themselves, and the men who breathed it experienced a destruction of the tissues of the throat and lungs that was, for those who received a lethal dose, a death by drowning in their own fluids. For those who received a sublethal dose and survived, the long-term damage to the respiratory system was permanent. Phosgene followed chlorine as a weapon, and it was in some ways more dangerous because it was less immediately detectable. It smelled faintly of freshly cut hay, a smell that was not alarming in any obvious way, and its effects were often delayed, so that men who had been exposed did not know they had received a lethal dose until hours later, when the damage to their lungs became apparent and they began to die. Mustard gas, introduced in 1917, was different again. It was not primarily a respiratory weapon. It was a persistent blister agent, a chemical that contaminated ground and surfaces and the clothing of men who moved through affected areas, producing delayed chemical burns on any skin it contacted, devastating damage to the eyes that in severe cases caused permanent blindness, and effects on the lungs when inhaled that combined with the skin and eye damage to produce casualties who required enormous amounts of medical care over very long periods. The persistence of mustard gas meant that ground that had been contaminated remained dangerous for days, that men who walked through an affected area without knowing it was affected could receive significant doses before the symptoms appeared. The experience of a gas attack was something that survivors described in terms that emphasized the speed with which the situation could change and the particular quality of helplessness it produced. In artillery fire, there was at least a sound warning, however brief, and there were things you could do: throw yourself flat, get into a dugout, move away from the fall of shot. In a gas attack, the warning came from smell or sight, and the correct response was to put on the gas mask immediately and keep it on until the area was clear. The gas masks that were issued improved over the course of the war, but early versions were uncomfortable and imperfect. Men who were sleeping when a gas attack occurred might not wake in time. Men in the middle of an infantry assault could not break off to don their masks without consequences. Men who were already wounded and in shock sometimes lacked the manual coordination to fit their masks correctly. The gas was indifferent to all of these circumstances. The British alone suffered approximately 188,000 gas casualties during the war. Of these, approximately 6,000 died. The rest survived with varying degrees of long-term damage. The men who were blinded by mustard gas were numerous enough that St. Dunstan's, a charitable organization for blind veterans, was established in 1915 and was overwhelmed by the end of the war with men whose eyes had been destroyed by a chemical weapon. Sargent's painting, Gassed, shows a line of blindfolded men walking in single file, each with a hand on the shoulder of the man in front, being led by an attendant across a field. It is a compositional choice that captures something real about the experience of gas casualties and about the scale of what had been done to ordinary people by weapons that had been designed in laboratories by men who would never be within range of them. The food that men ate in the trenches represented another form of deprivation that became normalized into the structure of daily life. The ration systems of all the major armies were, in theory, designed to provide adequate nutrition for men engaged in heavy physical activity under combat stress. In practice, the delivery of rations to the front line was subject to all the disruptions and hazards of the front itself. Carrying parties moving up to the front with food and supplies did so at night, moving through the dark along ground that was both difficult to navigate and dangerous, subject to the same artillery fire and sniper attention that everything else on the front was subject to. Men were killed carrying rations. Rations were lost in the mud and the dark. What arrived at the front line was frequently cold, sometimes contaminated, and often insufficient in quantity. The corned beef and hard biscuit that were staples of the British ration were substances that men consumed because there was nothing else, not because they provided any pleasure or because the body received them well over long periods. Plum and apple jam, the most commonly available variety, became a running complaint in the literature of the war because it was so universal and so consistently present regardless of what other provisions were available. Tea, brewed under whatever conditions existed, was a psychological anchor as much as a nutritional one, a ritual of normalcy in an environment that had abandoned normalcy. The rum ration, a small measure of dark rum issued before major operations, served a similar function, offering the body's chemical acknowledgement that something was about to happen. The German army operated under food conditions that deteriorated significantly as the war continued, and the Allied naval blockade reduced Germany's access to imported food. By 1917 and 1918, the German civilian population was experiencing genuine hunger, and the rations available to soldiers in the field, while prioritized over civilian consumption, reflected the overall shortage. Turnips, in every form they could be prepared, became a symbol of German wartime deprivation. The winter of 1916 to 1917 was known in Germany as the Turnip Winter. The malnutrition that spread through the German population during the war's later years was a contributing factor in the influenza pandemic's severity in Germany, because bodies already weakened by inadequate nutrition were less able to resist the disease. The prostitution economy that developed around the military bases and port cities was another reality of the war that official accounts minimized and institutional policies addressed through regulation rather than acknowledgement. Men who had leave time spent it in the cities and towns behind the front, and a significant portion of that time was spent in the company of women who were selling sexual access, some of them because the collapse of the ordinary economy had left them with few alternatives, some of them for reasons that the records do not capture because the records were not interested in capturing them. The French army established officially regulated brothels, the maisons tolérées, near military camps, on the theory that supervised prostitution was preferable to the alternative in terms of controlling the spread of venereal disease. The venereal disease rate among troops of all the major armies was significant enough to constitute a medical problem. The British Army, which maintained an official position of discouraging sexual contact and providing no formal facilities for it, experienced venereal disease rates that required hospitalization of large numbers of men, and that provoked considerable official anxiety about lost manpower. The response was a combination of moralizing medical lectures, the distribution of prophylactic materials, and punishment for men who contracted venereal disease and reported it, on the theory that the disease was self-inflicted, and therefore the soldier was responsible for the loss of his own effectiveness. This approach produced the entirely predictable result that men concealed their symptoms until they were too ill to function, at which point the treatment required was more extensive and the period of incapacity longer. The killing of prisoners was not a subject that official histories addressed directly, but that the testimony of participants confirms was a recurring feature of the war's reality. The conditions under which the frontline infantry war was fought made the taking and holding of prisoners logistically difficult in ways that soldiers acting under combat stress sometimes resolved in ways that were not consistent with the laws of war. Men who surrendered in the middle of an attack, when the assault was still in progress and there was no time and no capacity to manage prisoners, were sometimes killed. Men who were wounded and could not walk, and therefore could not be moved, were sometimes killed. These were not policy positions. They were the outcomes of individual decisions made under conditions that reduced the choices available to those making them. The accounts of prisoner killing appear in memoirs with a matter-of-factness that is itself significant. Men who described killing prisoners were often not describing it as a moral transgression, but as a practical reality of combat, as something that happened and that they had either done or witnessed without the framework of moral assessment that such an act would receive outside the context of the front. This is not a defense of the act. It is an observation about what sustained exposure to an environment where killing is the primary activity does to the categories through which a person processes their own actions and the actions they witness. The relations between officers and enlisted men in the armies of the First World War were shaped by the class structures of the societies that produced those armies in ways that had direct effects on how the war was experienced by different groups within those armies. In the British Army, the officer class was drawn overwhelmingly from the public school and university-educated upper and upper-middle classes. The enlisted men were overwhelmingly drawn from the working class. The expectations of each for the other, and the actual dynamics that developed between them in the conditions of the front, were complex and resist simple characterization. What the record shows, across memoirs and official histories and the letters of both officers and men, is that proximity under fire created bonds that crossed class lines in ways that peacetime society had not, while simultaneously preserving and sometimes reinforcing those class lines in the administration and management of the war. Officers ate separately from their men. Officers' dugouts were better appointed than the dugouts of the men they commanded. Officers were, in theory, responsible for the welfare of their men in ways that created genuine attachment in some cases and routine indifference in others. The casualty rates among junior officers in the British Army were proportionally higher than among enlisted men, which meant that the class that was most committed to the war socially and ideologically paid a disproportionate price for it in terms of the young men it sent. The subalterns, the second and first lieutenants who led platoons and sections over the top in the major offensives, were killed at a rate that emptied the pre-war officer class of much of its younger generation. The public schools of England sent boys into the war who were expected to lead by example, to be first out of the trench, to set a pace of advance for the men behind them, to show no fear regardless of what they were feeling. Many of them died before they were 20. The replacement officers who were commissioned as the war continued were increasingly drawn from lower social strata as the supply of men from the original officer class was depleted, and this too shifted the dynamics within military units in ways that the institution adapted to and absorbed. The German spring offensives of 1918, which Ludendorff designed as a decisive blow intended to break the Allied line before American forces arrived in significant numbers, were the last great German attempt to win the war through the direct application of military force on the Western Front. The tactics employed, using specially trained stormtrooper units to infiltrate the enemy line rather than advancing in formation, were innovative enough to produce significant initial gains. The first days of Operation Michael, the largest of the spring offensives, were catastrophic for the British Fifth Army. Tens of thousands of men were captured. Ground that had been fought over for years was lost in hours. The Allied command, for a brief period, faced the possibility that the line would not hold. The men who were taken prisoner in those days and in the subsequent operations entered a captivity that was administered by an enemy army whose own logistical position was deteriorating rapidly. German prisoner-of-war camps in 1918 were operating on rations that reflected Germany's own food shortage. Men who had been already weakened by the conditions of the front were further weakened in captivity, and when the influenza pandemic arrived in the autumn of 1918, the combination of crowding and malnutrition in the camps produced mortality rates that were significantly higher than those among the general population. Men who had survived 4 years of the war died of influenza in the weeks before and after the armistice. The influenza pandemic of 1918, which eventually killed between 50 and 100 million people worldwide, more than the war itself killed, was intertwined with the war in ways that the official handling of it made impossible to fully track. The pandemic arrived in 3 waves, and the military populations of all the major armies were among the first and most severely affected populations in the first and second waves. Partly because the conditions of the front concentrated large numbers of people in close quarters, and partly because the movement of troops across the world spread the virus efficiently to populations that had no prior immunity. The wartime censorship that prevented reporting on military setbacks and demoralization also prevented adequate public reporting on the pandemic's early spread, on the theory that reporting on mass illness would have the same effect on civilian morale as reporting on military disaster. The result was that the public was warned inadequately, that individual responses were therefore inadequate, and that the death toll was higher than it might have been. The armistice of November 11, 1918 came into effect at 11 o'clock in the morning, an hour chosen for its symbolic quality. In the hours before 11, artillery on both sides continued to fire. Orders for attacks that had been planned before the armistice was confirmed were not rescinded in all cases, because the administrative machinery that had scheduled them was slower than the diplomatic machinery that had ended the war. Men who were killed between the signing of the armistice in the early morning hours and its coming into effect at 11 o'clock constitute one of the war's most pointless categories of casualty. They died in a war that had already ended on paper, killed by weapons fired by men who knew that the war was ending and who fired them anyway because the orders had been given and the war's machinery continued to run on the momentum of 4 years. The final day of the war produced casualties that historians have calculated at approximately 11,000 dead, wounded and missing, a figure comparable to the casualty rates of many ordinary days during the worst periods of the fighting. On a day when everyone knew the war was ending, the rate of killing was not significantly lower than on days when nobody knew what was coming. The soldiers who survived and went home carried with them something that the societies they returned to were not equipped to receive. The war had lasted long enough to reshape the people who fought it at a fundamental level, to alter their relationship to violence and death and noise and authority and the future in ways that did not resolve when the fighting stopped. The condition that would eventually be understood as post-traumatic stress disorder was widespread among veterans of all the belligerent nations, manifesting in the years after the war in alcoholism, in violence, in the inability to maintain employment or relationships, in nightmares and flashbacks, and the sudden panic that loud noises produced in men who had spent years in an environment where loud noises meant incoming shells. The pension systems that were supposed to support disabled veterans were inadequate in most countries and were actively hostile in some. Men who applied for pensions on the basis of psychological damage were often denied, because the systems had been built around physical injury and did not have categories for what had happened to the men's minds. Men who were physically disabled received pensions calibrated to the level of their disability, assessments made by medical boards that had their own reasons for being conservative in their classifications, because every man classified as significantly disabled was a cost to a state that had already spent everything it had on the war itself. Men whose injuries deteriorated over time, as many injuries from gas exposure did, might find that the pension they had been awarded was based on an assessment made before the deterioration, and that revising it upward required navigating a bureaucratic process that was not designed to be navigated easily. The memorials were built, and the ceremonies were established, and the November silences were observed, and these things were real expressions of grief and acknowledgement. They were also, in their form and content, shaped by the need to frame the war as something that could be commemorated without requiring a fundamental reassessment of the decisions that had produced it. The unknown soldier, buried in Westminster Abbey and in the corresponding monuments of France, Belgium, and Germany, was a powerful symbol precisely because the unknown soldier could be anyone, could be the specific man that any specific family had lost, and could carry the weight of the collective grief without the need to attach to it any particular account of why the man had died and whether it had been necessary. The men who were buried as unknown soldiers were unknown not by design, but by circumstance, by the conditions of the front that had made individual identification impossible. That the institution took that circumstance and made it into a monument was, in its way, characteristic. The war's machinery had processed the loss of individual identity as a logistical problem and a statistical reality. The peace made it into a ritual. The ritual was genuine, and the ritual did not change what had happened. The war ended in November of 1918. The peace treaty was signed at Versailles in June of 1919. The terms imposed on Germany were harsh enough to generate resentment that would be exploited by political movements over the following years, and lenient enough not to prevent Germany from recovering the economic and military capacity that would eventually produce another war. The men who had survived the First World War, in all the countries that had fought it, were in their 20s and 30s when the Second World War began. Many of them served in it. Some of them commanded it. The Western Front, when the war ended, was not restored. The ground that had been fought over, the ground that had been shelled continuously for 4 years and contaminated with unexploded ordnance and the chemical residue of gas attacks and the remains of the dead, could not simply be returned to agriculture. Sections of Belgium and France were designated as the Zone Rouge, the Red Zone, land so severely damaged that it was permanently excluded from normal use. Some of those sections remain in the Zone Rouge today. The unexploded ordnance from the First World War is still discovered across the former front, still detonated by farmers and construction workers and land clearance teams. The Iron Harvest, it is called, the annual collection of shells and grenades and mortar rounds that the earth continues to yield more than 100 years after the guns stopped firing. The bodies of men continue to be found as well. Found, identified when possible, and buried, because the work of accounting for the dead was never finished during the war and has never been finished since.